seeing the woman punch in the numbers with the assurance of someone who owned the venue. She was in broad daylight, standing at the keypad of my private security gate, not even trying to hide it. The gate slid open with a familiar beep, and just like that, 3 strangers stepped onto my land like it was some public park. She smirked over her shoulder and whispered to the 2 youngsters behind her. "Don't worry," Karen remarked. "While I was not home, my cameras were. I almost spilled my coffee when I sat at a cafe across town viewing the live feed on my phone. That gate was my own line of protection from HOA craziness. Not only a beautiful door, and apparently the village queen herself had distributed the code like Halloween candy. Although I knew nothing about her, at that instant I knew one thing for sure. Karen had declared war, and I was not going down silently. Building the gate was meant to bring tranquility, silence. I work as a game designer. I enjoy my alone time. Under control, not anarchy outside my front porch on a screen. I took great care when I moved into this suburban HOA-run community last year. I obtained licenses, paid extra to enhance the security system, put motion-activated lighting, laser sensors, even a voice-activated speaker capable of playing anything from Beethoven to barking dogs. Not because I was worried, rather, I had learned the hard way in my previous area what occurs when people disregard limits. I never would have imagined a neighbor who believed the street was her realm actively undermining those limits from the inside. Not elected, Karen was the kind of person who wore tennis visors indoors and introduced herself, using the whole sentence, "I am the face of this HOA." Nobody recalled casting a ballot. She did, however, show up at every door bearing welcome baskets and lists of regulations she had printed herself. I initially ran across her the day I moved in. She marched right up to my porch and said, "You must be Jason." I answered, "It's Jackson." She added, "Close enough." Then, without asking, she handed me a bundle of community ordinances she had underlined in red ink. I never opened it. I thanked her graciously. That ought to have served as my first alert. Things were good originally. Karen ignored me, and I didn't give her any justification either. I kept my grass under control. I did not throw boisterous celebrations. When none else would, I even corrected the flickering community lamppost. Then followed the little transgressions. A note in my mailbox about too many weeds in the flower bed, a caution affixed to my garbage can about correct lid orientation, and ultimately the passive-aggressive remark during a casual wave when she said, "It's nice to have quiet neighbors who know their place." I ought to have answered then, but I let it go. This was my second error. 3 weeks before the gate incident, there was a significant turning point. Having just completed a randomized digital code and backup mobile app upgrade of the access system, I just gave my delivery service, police, and the local fire department the code. Not even my own brother had. People started showing up unannounced, though, suddenly. Thinking it would be a shortcut to the tennis courts, one yoga pants woman came into my backyard, inquiring as to whether this was the location of the pool party. A teenager knocked on my garage, and a DoorDash guy tried to hand me someone else's Chinese cuisine. Every single one of them said Karen when I inquired how they arrived. First time it happened, I confronted her. She was standing in her front yard reorganizing the potted plants in color sequence. Walking up, I said, "Hey Karen, did you give out my gate code?" She blinked as like she remembered nothing about me. "Oh, that thing," she remarked dismissively. I informed her that the code was private. People just asked, and I figured it was fine. We're all neighbors, right? She shrugged and said, "It's not like it's your bank password." Not only at her boldness, but also at the pure confidence in her voice, which suggested she really felt she had the power to violate my privacy. She should not repeat it, I advised her. She promised sarcastically and turned back toward her begonias. I then updated the backup server, reconfigured the keypad, changed the code. That would be the conclusion of it, I thought. I clearly, nonetheless, undervalued her will. Seeing those 3 strangers pass through the fence that morning made one thing clear. Karen was actively addressing my request rather than merely dysregulating it. And if she wanted to personalize this, then so be it. I remained silent. Unlike she most likely would have done, I did not march over and pound on her door. I behaved even worse. I began to consider, dealing with a narcissist makes exacting retribution difficult. They can't endure public humiliation, yet they never think they are mistaken. And I would formally assign Karen the position should she wish. To be the neighborhood concierge, I only required some imagination and the correct set of numbers. I dug through old emails and gathered the digital version of the neighborhood roster Karen had produced for a welcome packet. It featured her personal cell, naturally including contact numbers for emergency HOA assistance. After saving the number, I opened my gate system and modified the code to correspond to her 10-digit number. It had beauty. Unless they knew her, nobody would suspect it. Those who did would not dare mistreat it evermore. After that, I printed a sign, not accusing or furious, simply courteous and imprecise enough to be HOA friendly. Notice, gate code has been changed per neighborhood courtesy. Please contact Karen, HOA liaison for access. I laminated it, zip-tied it to the keypad, then back off and waited. The aftermath began 1 hour ago. First, Karen, a puzzle delivery man seeking entrance, asked questions. Then around 6:30 neighbors visiting and texted her. She had over 40 missed calls before midday and 5 irate voicemails from individuals wondering why they couldn't get in. I was drinking coffee on my patio watching her phone blossom like a comedy marathon. It was blowing. Red-faced and screaming into her phone, she stormed outdoors mid-afternoon, walking in high heels on her grass. She said something regarding harassment and immediate need for a code change. I grinned since now she understood what it felt like. The finest thing was that I had not breached any one guideline. The code passed security. Nobody was being refused access. They simply had to go via the very person who made it free-for-all. I had not called her straight or cursed her name. I let her sink amid the very anarchy she produced. And I experienced something I hadn't in a long time, peace. First time since I moved in. But I knew Karen wasn't the kind to hit and back off from. She was planning something, not sure exactly. And even as I savored the quiet that afternoon, I knew the real game was just starting. Karen hated losing anything, as when a gate becomes a battlefield and a keypad becomes a weapon. The war isn't done until someone loses their crown. The next morning started with a knock that seemed more like an insult than a greeting. Opening the door, I found Karen standing there with her phone clenched like a courtroom exhibit and a stiff jaw. Her false smile returned. The kind individuals where before posing a threat veiled as a compliment. Her tone at first was sugary, not at line with the fury in her eyes. She continued, waving a plate like it were a peace pack made in vanilla icing. "I brought you some cupcakes." They were obviously store-bought, half-turned, and badly frosted. I moved from the doorway, but accepted one merely to be courteous. The term friendly seemed more like a curse coming from her mouth as she started a protracted, meandering story about how misinterpreted she was, how people in the area depended on her for access, how she was only trying to keep things friendly. She danced about the subject for some time until at last she exclaimed, "So you're really not going to change it back?" She opened her mouth as if to argue, but nothing came out as I answered coolly, "Why would I? You're the one who gave the code to half the town." Her brain was most likely in between excitement and outburst. She snarled at last, "You made me look like an idiot." I nodded, not even trying to contradict. She spun around with a dramatic huff and rushed back toward her house, heels cutting the grass like knives. I understood that was not its final destination. Karen never stopped even in graceful loss. She would withdraw to recover, most likely pace her kitchen for hours, planning her next action like a Bond villain with PDA membership. Certainly enough, the sabotage started within a few days. I chose to do the most Karen-proof return of favors. I set up a panoramic view supplementary security camera on a pole close to the roadway. For good measure, I enabled the system to notify my smartwatch anytime someone remained close to the keyboard. I put a laminated sign behind it. Gate access monitored 24/7. Please smile. I received daily alarms at first. Every time, Karen or one of her inquisitive assistants was attempting to figure out what fresh trick I had put in place. I had nothing else to do. Let them stew in their ignorance. Karen's most recent effort manifested itself as a gift basket. She left it on my porch without running the bell. The irony almost had me pass out inside among some stale cookies, a perfumed candle, and a handwritten note saying, "Let's not let a keypad come between neighbors." I snapped a picture of it, forwarded it to a group chat, including 6 other neighbors, who had all run-ins with her, and just tagged it with Dayton. One of them said, "She must be running out of ideas," after they responded back laughing emojis. I did not, however, minimize her. Karen's strength was volume rather than finesse. She launched herself into the next, without pausing when she lost one fight. I knew what she would do next now she had failed to charm me, failed to threaten me, and failed to outwit me with sabotage. She would be large. She would try to depict me as the enemy, organize the HOA board against me, and turn bureaucracy into her last weapon. That's when I began gathering a file with every false note, every video clip, every screen grab of her messages. I tagged it Karen Gate. It included timestamps, dates, and even some side-by-side comparison images illustrating the variations between her printed warnings and actual HOA letters. I was preserving this digital file of pettiness for the proper moment. It was a pettiness digital dossier. Karen preferred to fight wars in whispers and pamphlets, while I was getting ready for full-scale HOA conflict. And when it came, I was going to be legendary, not only prepared. It began with a letter more like an invitation than a threat. Elegant envelope, gold trim, and the HOA logo printed with pointless flourish. Inside was a folded page headed Emergency HOA Meeting, Complaint against Resident Jackson Miller, who filed it was not a secret, by use of coercion and potluck bribery. Karen had finally pushed matters to her preferred arena, the committee circus she controlled. But this time she was dealing with someone with a digital receipt war chest and no flinching at bureaucracy. I smiled at the letter instead of reading it, since I had been waiting for this precise action and already had my ammo loaded and ready. Thursday night in the clubhouse, a plain facility like a discarded wedding venue with folding chairs and coffee that felt like regret. The meeting was set. Arriving 10 minutes early, I presented a nice appearance and carried just my laptop and a quiet demeanor. Karen, on the other hand, moved in like a presidential contender. She greeted every board member with practiced kindness, wore a brilliant red blazer, and had a binder under her arm. The room quickly filled largely with neighbors eager to see whatever drama was about to start. Karen took great pleasure in attention. Most likely, she thought this would be her best performance. Mr. Robbins, a retired dentist with the demeanor of a soggy cracker, but at least fair-minded, opened the meeting. Karen got up right away and spoke for about 7 straight uninterrupted minutes. She said of me aggressive, hostile, and disturbing community peace. She said I had created a climate of monitoring and terror, generated unnecessary tension, and militarized technology against innocent residents. Its dramatic scope was remarkable, with emotive pauses and overdone victimhood. At one point she even dabbed at her eyes, as if she had just reported a personal tragedy rather than a keyboard modification. I waited patiently, letting her excavate the hole sufficiently deep. I stood, opened her laptop, and said one thing before pushing play. "I'd like to show you what actually happened." The first video rolled when she at last sat down. It was the video showing 3 strangers using my private gate, referencing Karen by name. I let it run long enough to capture the whole ridiculousness. Then came the video of Karen teaching a little child how to play with a keypad. Then the sign I put there and her explosive response to it. Except for a few startled whispers, the room was quiet. I omitted adding comments. I wasn't needed for it. The video was louder than any speech could be. Next, I exhibited side-by-side comparisons of official HOA warnings and the false warning she had attached to my fence. The fonts didn't match. The signature line was different. One even contained a mistake in the term compliance. I displayed the zoning complaint addressed to the city and how the handwriting matched Karen's notes from previous HOA flyers. I even have screenshots of her internet rage and how she later erased it after being questioned. It wasn't simply a defense, it was a dismantling. When I was done, I closed the laptop carefully and looked around the room. I've never broken a single HOA rule. I've documented every interaction. I've never retaliated illegally or even spoken disrespectfully. All I did was change my gate code to protect my property. And now I'm the one on trial, It wasn't even a speech. It was merely the truth laid plain. The members of the board were shocked. A few neighbors silently clapped, then stopped knowing where they were. Karen, for once, did not have a quick rebound. She sat there red, mouth slightly open, frozen. She resembled someone who had just watched their own collapse reflected on a screen, less like a neighborhood leader. Then, though, came the twist I had not even considered. Older guy Mr. Jennings stood up from 2 houses across. He was modest and respected. He hardly participated in HOA politics. He now cleared his throat and continued, "I need to say something." Everyone turned. He said that weeks before the event even surfaced, Karen personally handed him the gate code. She informed him, he said, "Don't worry about Jackson." He said, "She has done similar things with other residents, including letting someone's cousin host a yoga session on the greenbelt behind my property." He then stated that he is simply a little private. Until recently, none else knew either. When Karen tried to cut in, Jennings held out a hand and said, "Enough, Karen. We are not morons." Simply said, we wanted no involvement. But this has progressed too far. The space turned. People saw her now not with irritation, but with disappointment. That was awful. Directly, the board chair asked her whether she had indeed shared the code without authorization, trying to twist her remarks as neighborly convenience. Karen stammered over them, but damage was done. The board decided unanimously to condemn her for using her position improperly and invading neighbor privacy. They also assigned me to a new interim subcommittee on digital policy and gate security. The irony practically made me chuckle. Karen had hauled me in hoping for humiliation. I left. People came to thank me one by one after the conference. Some said they had been reluctant to call attention to Karen's actions. One woman murmured that Karen previously tried to punish her for drying laundry outside on a Tuesday. Another individual mentioned Karen had approved her private floral garden expansion onto a public area. Exposing her seemed to have broken some sort of enchantment. She walked no more with the haughtiness of someone untouchable. Her porch light went off that evening, for the first time in many months. Not a clip-through, not with binoculars, just silence and darkness. For my own record, not for vengeance, I went home, sat on my porch, and played back the meeting footage I had surreptitiously taped, simply to recall the instant the tide changed. Karen had not only lost a disagreement, she no longer had her audience. Her authority derived from fear, from neighbors too tired to oppose her, but the rest collapsed like dominoes once the dread broke. I still knew, though, this was not her last action. People like Karen do not silently fade. She might withdraw, reorganize, try another approach, call the media, criticize politics, charge the HOA of bias. But it made no difference anymore, because her reputation was destroyed, and the neighborhood had seen what she truly was. Even if she attempted to stir the pot once again, nobody would overlook those movies or the moment Mr. Jennings stepped up and uttered enough. It was done. Alternatively, at least this conflict was smaller. More pettier forms of the war might persist. But right now, tranquility draped over my land like a cozy blanket. As I reset the code, not to her number this time, but to something even more secure, the gate beeped, and I grinned as seated there staring at the night sky. Not because I won, rather, I proved you could win without bending down to their level. You merely have to let the truth blossom on its own and survive the anarchy. The next week was remarkably quiet, which made me more dubious than glad. Karen had disappeared from her typical locations. No morning patrols with a clipboard, no nightly pacing by the gate, no fresh postings in the neighborhood forum, where she usually treated her neighbors like peasants needing regulation. First, I considered perhaps she had at last accepted the defeat and chosen to back off. Deeply down, though, I knew better. Karen did not quit right away. She paused, then computed and returned swinging. Simply said, it was a question of timing and frequency. That reply arrived on Monday morning when a local news van stopped outside the HOA clubhouse. First, I assumed they were coming to cover a gardening expo or a community event, but I knew exactly what this was when the reporter left and Karen was already waiting at the clubhouse door, grinning broadly and carrying a stack of folders under her arm. Karen was going through a comeback. She brought the media in for points of sympathy. And I knew in her most recent attempt at atonement, I would be publicly thrown under the bus. Standing across the street, I watched and drank coffee behind the hedges of a neighbor. Still, I wanted no part in this. Pointing at the gate keypad, Karen guided the reporter around the entry, using dramatic gestures reminiscent of a crime scene. As she described her version of events, the camera rolled, casting her as a misguided HOA volunteer under attack by a paranoid neighbor carrying a grudge. She mentioned technological bullying and privacy abuse, and even likened my security system to government monitoring. She once pointed squarely at my house and exclaimed, "He turned a friendly gate code into a weapon of mass humiliation." I choked almost on my coffee. Karen was ignorant of my recognition of the reporter. Micah was my roommate for one terrible semester in college before he walked out to follow the media. Though we hadn't spoken in years, I could definitely remember him. More significantly still, he remembered me. From a hidden number, I texted him one line. Ask her why the gate code she gave out was changed to her phone number. 3 minutes later, he stopped the session and asked a strange head tilt. A viewer tip arrived just now. Could you verify whether your personal cell number was the gate code you supplied? Clearly startled, Karen blinked quickly and glanced down at her folder. She tried to deflect, saying privacy prevented her from confirming the code. Pressing harder, Micah asked whether she thought it appropriate to provide others private access without owner permission. Her voice wavering, she stumbled something about community service and presumed understanding. All the opening Micah needed was that. He closed his notepad, nodded softly, and gently thanked her for her time. Karen's smile fell apart the instant the camera turned off. She came to see this was not the narrative she was writing. Micah checked in with me later that evening. Although he had already assembled a section called Neighborhood Tech Showdown, the tip changed the story. The narrative concentrated on growing tensions in suburban areas and on the way technology was either being abused or misinterpreted. He mentioned the HOA resident who deployed smart technologies to safeguard his property following several breaches, but he omitted my name. The video revealed Karen shouting about digital tyranny and swinging her arms. The video got rather viral, particularly the bit in which she claimed she was being gatekept in her own neighborhood. The comments were nasty. The HOA board got 3 fresh complaints directed against Karen that same week. One came from a neighbor asserting she had lied about a board vote. Another accused her of harassment over lawn decor. The third complaint, however, was more severe. A local crippled veteran who had moved in silently 2 houses overstated that Karen had informed him he wasn't permitted to park his adapted vehicle in his driveway because it wasn't aesthetically aligned with the neighborhood vision. The man had tape of the conversation. The board was hot. I finally agreed to meet with the HOA board secretly, as the momentum obviously changed. I showed them a thorough track of everything that had happened since the initial incident with my gate. Every recorded attempt at manipulation, every false warning she had created, every passive-aggressive letter she had sent to me or someone. I kept it from being dramatic. I simply arranged it like a perfectly nicely coded file, dated, orderly, and totally indisputable. They indicated they would consider it under advice and thanked me. At this point, Mr. Robbins, the board chair, moved forward and asked me whether I would be ready to supervise digital infrastructure for the neighborhood, including gate entry, security systems, and homeowner tech privacy. I told him I was not interested in being another Karen, but I would assist in developing new procedures to guarantee no one else had to deal with this degree of stupidity once more. Grinning, he said, "Good. Because people mistaking influence with authority irritates us." The next day, there was a notice declaring the Neighborhood Privacy and Tech Committee to be established. There was not a mention of Karen anywhere. She was actually taken out of her self-appointed position of community liaison totally. She skipped the following HOA meeting. There were whispers floating about. She was out of town, said some. Others asserted she was preparing legal action. But I didn't give a damn. The gate kept silent. The area calmed down. And for once, Karen said it was okay. Meant there were no unexplained pizza deliveries, children cutting through my yard, or unwelcome guests requesting to use my bathroom. I ran across her one afternoon. With arms crossed, she was standing at the brink of her lawn, fixated on the newly installed keypad at the community entrance. a device I had helped install requiring revolving codes linked to home accounts. She understood she had no master key anymore. None of anyone did. It was dispersed fairly by system rather than by self-importance. She spun around and silently headed back inside. Still, the tale did not finish there. Nor from Karen, nor from the board, but from a lawyer. I received a letter precisely when I assumed the theater had closed permanently. It was a notice of a cease and desist. Vague rhetoric regarding public humiliation and slander. Not clearly charged. Not specific. Just a forceful bluff. I looked at it once and emailed a buddy Ellie, a real-time practicing attorney. She chuckled and responded to me with a complete legal analysis detailing why Karen lacked a single foot to stand on, let alone a legal leg. After printing her answer, I carefully folded it and carried it over to Karen's mailbox. I did not knock. I left little time. I turned, put it in, then turned away. I felt as though I had closed a chapter that no longer required a revision for the first time since this entire process began. Karen had played every card she had. Manipulation, charm, sabotage, publicity, legal scare tactics, and every time she lost ground. Not because I attacked her, but rather because I declined to participate in her game. Eventually, it had nothing to do with a keypad or a gate code. It was about personal as much as physical limits. Karen felt closeness, gave her power. Being neighbors means sharing our space, time, and serenity as well as responsibility. She discovered by experience that respect is something you earn rather than something you steal. And after it's gone, no code existing anywhere can open that door once more. 2 months had gone since the cease and desist letter dropped with a thump in my mailbox, and the neighborhood had at last come to seem normal. Now the keypad code rotation system was standard. The residents valued limits, and the comment "Karen said it's fine" had evolved from a permission slip to a joke. But Karen gave her last performance, a frantic, last-ditch attempt to recover the attention she thought was hers by birthright, just as I thought the tempest had finally passed. This time she was not subtle. She was theatrical, delusional, and totally ignorant of the fact that her last performance would be most embarrassing. It began with flyers, beautiful ones printed professionally, tucked under car wipers, taped to streetlights. They showed up overnight, even sliding inside front doors. At the top in big cursive type, it said, "Take back our neighborhood." The remainder was a rumbling manifesto criticizing the HOA board of corruption, me of digital tyranny, and the new security system of violating neighborly trust. She presented herself as a whistleblower, a lady harmed by the system she formerly defended. At the bottom included a time and date for an allegedly emergency community meeting. She lacked jurisdiction to call it. Her own front yard hosted it. It was funny. Still, it was like a last test somehow. I had not intended to show up. I was not interested in giving her front stage. But fate has an unusual sense of comedy. I got a knock on the door early on from her backyard revolt. Once more, it was Mr. Jennings, looking somewhat tired and clutching one of Karen's flyers. "Are you planning to show up?" he asked me gently. "No," I told him. Nodding, he added, "I think you should. Not for her, for the people she's still manipulating." He had nothing to be incorrect. Notwithstanding all, a few of the residents were unaware of the whole scope of events. Someone needed to provide the receipt if Karen were rewriting history on her grass. I showed up 15 minutes after the conference got underway. About 30 individuals sat or stood in lawn chairs on Karen's well-kept grass, like she was campaigning for office. She stood at the front speaking into a microphone hooked into a portable speaker. She carried a glittering binder and dressed in white pantsuit. She stumbled for a moment as she spotted me approaching, then kept on. She talked of togetherness, of overreach, of neighbors becoming enemies under the aggressive tech and power-hungry people. She cited me several times, without mentioning my name. Everyone knew. She presented herself as a martyr silenced for too much compassion. Arms crossed, I silently stood at the rear, not interrupting. But then something quite amazing occurred. Rising from among the audience, a woman said, "Didn't you give out his gate code without asking?" Karen's eyes twitched. She answered with a polished response concerning common access and presumptions of permission. "Is it true the new code was your phone number?" Another inquired, saying that was an unfortunate coincidence. Karen sought to dismiss it. Another voice added, "How do you explain the tampering footage?" The audience started to doubt, rather than pay attention suddenly. And Karen lacked responses as well. Seeing the tide change, I moved onward, not to celebrate, but rather to complete the narrative she was rewriting. I spoke to the gathering coolly. Everything I did, I reminded them, was a reaction. That every action I took followed repeated invasions of my right. I went over the committee reforms, the code changes, and the technology enhancements. I didn't do all of this to win, I then stated, something I hadn't expressed before in public. I did it as nobody else should have to struggle so much to be left alone. After I was done, there was quiet. Not embarrassing, just weighty. Blinking fast, Karen stood there and turned pages in her binder as though some magical retort would show up. It failed. She murmured something about legal advice and began to pack her belongings. People started to go. Some came up to thank me or apologies for not saying anything before. "I wish you had been on the board years ago," one man remarked, shaking my hand. I turned around and saw Karen's. Backyard had never looked so vacant. Her strength did not drop in a stunning explosion. It faded gently as truth exceeded the volume of her voice. She hardly showed up after that. She reportedly was thinking of selling her residence. Others asserted she was complaining to the regional HOA council, an organization devoid of actual authority but rife with documentation. None of it, though, really mattered. Her reputation suffered from indisputable facts rather than from insults. The neighbors she used to rule now turned away from her. The newly arriving families were given revised guidelines and actual contacts. Nobody today called her the face of the HOA. She was exactly Karen once more. And for her, that was the worst penalty known. Regarding myself, when I moved in, peace was the last thing I desired. I rebuilt my porch, put fresh hedges in place, and even asked a few neighbors over for a laid-back cookout. The last of the stress had vanished. Children giggled without thinking about keeping off the sidewalk. Dogs barked freely without Karen capturing images for a complaint. At last the neighborhood had exhaled. Not for security but for comedy. I changed the gate one last time. I included a tiny screen above the keypad. One of the brief messages that greeted someone approaching was "Welcome." Access allowed by respect rather than entitlement. It was subtle. Everyone who had seen the drama, though, understood the humor. One neighbor even brought me a mug bearing "Gatekeeper of Sanity." I laughed, but beneath it I felt glad of what the term implied. And then arrived at the last turn. A moving truck stopped in Karen's driveway one day. With arms crossed, she stood at the brink of her porch observing the workers, using the last shard of control she possessed. One of the movers stepped up to the gate and tried to punch in a code as they were completing loading the last boxes. "What's the new code again?" he yelled at Karen when it didn't work. She turned to stare at him, turned to examine the keypad, then gazed up at the camera, face full of worn-out surrender. She seemed to be poised to scream for a second. She failed, though. She turned aside, went to her car, and drove off. I saw her nowhere more recently. The gate slid quiet and smoothly behind her, and retaliation was not necessary for the first time since this narrative started. Not necessary to create another strategy. There is no need to protect my area. It had been reclaimed, not with hostility but with tenacity, via surpassing, by illustrating that occasionally the best defense is not reprisals. It simply refuses to be pushed about. That was the last lesson as well. Neither the volume of your voice nor the number of individuals afraid of your name define power. Your actions reflect integrity. And how long are you ready to stand your own without turning into what you are opposing? That gate anchored me to what counted. Not only kept people out, and it did not crash when it closed for the last time under Karen's direction. It clicked, quiet, final, and flawless.